fact. We have some very effective treatments for a wide range of sexual dysfunctions, in erectile dysfunction, in sexual pain disorders in men, premature ejaculation par excellence. The focus is very much on penile-vaginal penetration. And we tend not to think too much about sex beyond penile-vaginal penetration when people come to speak to us in sexual medicine practice seeking advice. And I hope over the next 15 minutes to persuade you that perhaps we do need to think about some of the other things as well. So first of all, my few disclosures. None of these companies have probably ever done any research which has looked at sexual behaviours which people find pleasurable and practice widely as part of their clinical programs, because instruments like the IEF focus upon vaginal intercourse. So let's look at these other sexual behaviours. First, a few words about language. What do you call these other behaviours? They're variants to penile-vaginal intercourse. They might be considered unusual, atypical, non-conforming. But that can apply to anything that is not penile-vaginal intercourse, which is prescribed as the right sort of sex by many cultural and religious authorities. We tend to think of people who practice other behaviours as being part of a sexual minority. It's a very large minority, as I will demonstrate shortly, and we consider perhaps people who do other things than penile-vaginal intercourse as having some form of unusual preference, or perhaps, if they're really unlucky, we'll lump them in with people who have a paraphilia or disorder of sexual preference. Terms like sexual perversion and sexual deviance have no place in sexual medicine practice. So we have penile-vaginal intercourse approved, we have these other behaviours rejected, and typically, if they're not usually mentioned at all, but may be denied. So, a couple of words about orientation and sexual identity, because this too is important. Orientation refers to the idea that we're someone to whom we are sexually or romantically attracted. We must remember that orientation and behaviour are not the same thing. There are many gay, bisexual and lesbian people who practice a range of sexual behaviours, as do heterosexual people. In fact, the only behaviour that is unique is penile-vaginal intercourse, which is unique to heterosexuals, or at least to couples who exhibit heterosexual behaviours. Sexual orientation is not behaviour. Behaviour is with whom I have sex. Now, if you happen to be an inmate in a prison, your options are limited. So your sexual behaviour will be same-sex, but your orientation and sexual identity may remain heterosexual. To whom I want to have sex, we all have our fantasies, and fantasies come down to who do I fantasize having sex with when I'm being realistic. Who do I fall in love with? With which community do I identify? Many men and women identify with the heterosexual community in Western world, and certainly if they live in conservative societies, such as in South Asia or the Middle East, they may identify with a community which is actually not in congruence with their sexual identity, either because they deny it or because the risk of belonging to that community is high. Sexual identity is the orientation with which I identify, and there is a difference between those. Identity, orientation and behaviour may be congruent or incongruent, and even more confusingly, may be fluid over time. Now, there is evidence that sexual orientation is affected by immunological, genetic, endocrine factors. It's largely not social learning and is neurodevelopmental to some degree, and probably to a very large degree. But there is evidence that it can be flexible during the life cycle, that you are not born heterosexual or homosexual and stay that throughout your life. Certainly amongst gay men and lesbians, there is some change in attractions and behaviours during the course of the life cycle, and it is more common in lesbian and heterosexual women than it is in gay and straight men. The consequence of this is that we need to remember that sexual behaviours and sexual orientation, the desire for them may change during the course of life. The only group where there doesn't seem to be any change is amongst bisexual people. Bisexual people get a really raw deal. Nobody does much research on them. They're rather a group which has a low visibility, who are rejected by straight people and by gay and lesbian people as well to some extent. Social attitudes are changing, but people are often more reticent to reveal sexual interest in either sex or in no sex at all than they are to heterosexual and homosexual sexual intimacy. There are a range of attitudes towards the various behaviours that people will want to enjoy as part of their intimate and sexual lives. There's varying degrees of social disapproval, which are often influenced by culture, belief and religion. Masturbation makes you go blind, according to some authorities. Looking back on some of the Victorian and earlier treatises, it was thought that it also caused madness and ultimately death. Attitudes have changed somewhat. Oral sex, anal sex, extramarital sex, BDSM. I'm going to focus a little bit on BDSM in a minute. Behavioural stereotypes in minority populations are really sort of not very helpful. I think it's very unhelpful to talk about gay sex, because the only thing that gay men do that heterosexual men don't do is penile-vaginal intercourse. And even gay men may quite enjoy, may engage in penile-vaginal sex sometimes, even if it is not their normal sexual preference. Paraphilic social reaction rather depends on the object of sexual interest. If your interest is in exposing yourself, you'll get some social disapproval. If it is in leather, you're in leather or rubber, you may well find that you get a slightly different reaction. If your interest is in children, the social reaction is very different indeed. More on paraphilia at the end of this talk. I think it's very unhelpful to stereotype people by their behaviours. Straight sex, gay sex, lesbian sex, bisexual sex. Most of my work is now in gender services. Trans sex, whether it's binary or non-binary trans, is a very interesting area to work in, and I think perhaps a topic for another day. Preference and identity don't always match. Preferred behaviours aren't reliably associated with a specific sexual identity, and we need to avoid thinking in terms of heterosexual and homosexual behaviours. Identifying orientation in a sexual medicine consultation is important. Ask questions. Tell me about your relationship. Are you living with someone? That will allow the person you are interviewing to be able to reveal the gender of their partner more comfortably than perhaps you asking, are you married, or which is rather value laden, or are you homosexual? Going on to some of the behaviours, masturbation. It's practiced by 95% of men and by 71% of women at some time in the past in a British population survey in the 1990s. I just wonder about the 5% of men who aren't telling the truth there. It is a common activity. It is a useful source of sexual relief. It is more commonly practiced in people from higher socioeconomic groups and people who are better educated. In men, the more partnered sex they have, the less masturbation. For women, the other way around. The more partnered sex they have, the more likely they are to masturbate, provided that they're orgasmic. Oral sex. if you, most common in single and cohabiting couples, 88% of men, around 80% of women admit to oral sex sometime in the past year, around 2/3 in married men and women. Anal sex, same. So this is a slightly later survey, the second NatCell survey. Around 10% of men and women cohabiting and single admitted to having anal sex as part of their sexual repertoire. But looking at data in the United States, the figures were much higher. In 2005, 40% of men and 35% of women admitted to having heterosexual anal sex within the past year. This is a common sexual practice. We need to think of safer sex, giving safer sex advice to our patients who engage in oral and anal sex. Oral sex, things like condoms and dental dam, which is a film which you can place over the anus or vulva, can improve the aesthetics and also protect from sexually transmitted infection. For those who wondered why gents' toilets contained lager and lime flavoured condoms, all has now been revealed. Anal sex involves more than just penetration with a penis, finger, vibrator or dildo. Can include insertion of hand or even the forearm or oral contact as well. A little on BDSM. BDSM is derived from combination of these various initials: bondage and discipline, dominance and submission, sadism, masochism or sadomasochism. These relationships generally involve unequal roles being taken within a sexual relationship. One partner is usually dominant, the other taking a submissive role. These may be thought of as minority activities, but are in fact really quite common. It encompasses a range of practices, which are largely focused on role-playing, perhaps on restraint, ritualized humiliation. These things, not to be paraphilic, are consensual. They're not a paraphilia. There's a degree of ritualization which protects those involved in them from real harm taking place. They may take place within a relationship, an established relationship, and there is also a BDSM subculture which involves often communications through the internet for people who have particular interests and preferences. I said these things are reasonably common. Now, we have hit, my eyesight, unfortunately, is getting lousy these days, but the prevalence of BDSM activity, around 20% in a 2005 study carried out by the Durex organization, had handcuffs, blindfolds, things for the practice of restraint as part of their sexual repertoire, things that they used to enhance their sexual interest. Sort of activities, bondage, often the woman are more commonly in the dominant role. Many men, about half men, express interest in the United States of being tied up during sexual activity. Discipline and punishment form part of this repertoire of activities. Dominance and submission describe the psychological dynamic. It's what's exciting about this is it's not the sort of the equal sexual relationship. The couples who engage in this activity enjoy the difference in their roles. They enjoy being dominated or punished, or they may enjoy dominating and administering punishment. It is, as I said before, different from sexual sadism or sexual masochism disorder, which are paraphilias. BDSM is more common amongst gay men. It is commonly practiced to some extent by heterosexual couples, although some couples find that you find fewer married couples taking part in this. This type of behaviour is often not compatible with long-term relationships. But the important issue here is that it's not about peno-vaginal sex. If someone has a BDSM preference or a masturbation preference or an oral sex preference, then they need us to focus on enabling them to engage in that form of sexual intimacy and pleasure, which is legal, which brings them satisfaction and relationship satisfaction and psychological well-being, just as much as if we were helping them engage in penile-vaginal sex. Now, I'm going to leave it to Kobe to identify all of this. Our next speaker is going to be talking about piercing, pain and porn, which should be quite fun, but there are a number of sexual activities here which are part of the BDSM game. As I say, it's about play. You say it's a sex play rather than a perversion or paraphilia. Sometimes occurs in long-term relationships. There are also professional practitioners as well who sell their services. And there are various safeguards, contracts, rules. You can't. A lot of BDSM clubs, for instance, don't allow alcohol in order to reduce the risk of permanent harm or death. Paraphilia is a different beast. To be diagnosed with this, the individual has to have a compulsion for a sexual behaviour which causes them distress or may cause psychological damage, distress, injury or death to another person or be against the law. A very different case. They should not be confused with the sort of atypical variant sexual behaviours which I have just mentioned. They're very uncommon in women. It's generally a man's issue. Do not confuse paraphilia with sex play. Consensual adult activities are not paraphilia. Last slide, just to give you, is how common is paraphilic ideas? Research done in Germany a few years ago by Ahlers and colleagues, a community sample, not a clinical sample, from a German city, 62.4% of men reported having a sexual fantasy associated with a paraphilia. Of those, about 9.5% the paraphilia involved prepubertal children, but that only involved sexual fantasy. About 4% actually were committing sex offences, that they were child sex offences, and were acting out their fantasies. Paraphilic arousal, daydreams are really very common. We need to be aware that of these unusual sexual interests, and certainly where there is distress involved or where there are child protection issues involved, we need to involve the appropriate agencies in order to protect children from harm. So, lots of things. Think beyond the missionary position. There's a lot more to enjoyable sex than the missionary position. I'm sure perhaps some of you have discovered them. Even if you haven't yet discovered BDSM, some of your patients probably have. Variety is the spice of life. Thank you very much.
Thank you, John.